So today we're talking about Chapter 19, Section 4, and that is Wilson fighting for peace. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, entered the war on the public declaration of making the world safe for democracy. And after the war was over, the leaders of Europe met to discuss what should be done. Germany has now surrendered. Austria-Hungary have surrendered. Ottoman Empire have surrendered. What do we do with these former enemies? The trouble with this, and the drama comes in with the disagreements between America and Europe over what should be done, and that's what our section's really about. But first, the headline of the newspapers, since we've been doing headlines lately. Armistice is signed. Germany surrenders. Armistice means an end to the fighting. Shooting has ceased. Germany surrenders. Well, it's a little more complicated than that. Obviously, it's why it's just a headline, and there's a huge article about it. Because Germany surrendered, however, it was a conditional surrender. And now we have to negotiate the conditions of that surrender.
Rather than have their country invaded, German military leaders seek an armistice, an immediate ceasefire that will give the warring parties time to sit down and talk. Almost a year earlier, Wilson had presented his plan for a just peace.
When Wilson described why the United States was fighting, one of the slogans he developed was that the United States was fighting this war to end all wars. He said that the United States was fighting to make the world safe for democracy.
When Lenin takes over, he makes public secret treaties, and that basically shows that while the Allies claimed that they were fighting a war for right and democracy and human freedom, that behind closed doors they had negotiated these territorial exchanges of what they were going to gain when they won. And so this just seemed like, they're just fighting a war of conquest just like Germany is, so what's the difference? And Lenin challenges the world to make its war aims clear, and Wilson steps up with the 14 points.
14 different headings of how the world should be reordered after the war to create what he called a peace without victory. And what he meant by that was that the world after the war would differ from the world before by ending these secret alliances, these secret treaties. He thought that the war had been so devastating to the participants in Europe that now they would be willing to end this kind of greed that had led to the war.
And history since then has been a contest over whose vision would win out, a realist view of that nations are basically bad and that they will fight each other, and you just got to build up your strength as much as you can and deal with others that way from a position of strength, or that nations are capable of cooperating.
That is, everyone looking out for everyone else's interest through a general international organization, an organization which came to be called the League of Nations. That was the centerpiece of Wilson's program.
That's Wilsonianism, or liberal internationalism, based on an arbiter, on an organization that could lift itself outside the realm of nations and alliances and make policy decisions, or at least assess and judge and hand down decisions on which nation was right or wrong in a conflict.
Even when the 14 points were first issued, Britain and France were not supportive.
They're not fighting for just high principles. They are fighting to defeat Germany, and they want a peace of vengeance against Germany, and they're fighting for territory. They expect German colonies to be transferred to them when the war is over, and they expect Germany to pay. So Wilson issues the 14 points. Clemenceau doesn't even read them until Germany sues for an armistice based on them. And so right there we're seeing the foundation for problems that will become clearer when the peace is actually being negotiated.
And so let's learn about Wilson's 14 points. So, a couple things in the video that you might have missed. One, Wilson proposed the 14 points. This was an American plan to end the First World War. Germany agreed to surrender under these conditions of the 14 points. Europe disagreed. The European nations hope to gain territory from this war. They hope to seek vengeance against Germany for invading their countries and killing so many. Meanwhile, Woodrow Wilson won the Nobel Peace Prize for his plan. And as brilliant as this plan is, it was rejected. However, it's still important to learn about because it sets a precedent for how nations should interact with one another. If you remember Wilson's moral diplomacy, this is very much an extension of that. The first 5 points were all about how to prevent future war. Number 1 is open treaties. If you're going to make an alliance with another country, it has to be public. Secondly, international waters should be a free place where people can travel and not be in danger from ships from other countries. Freedom of the seas. He believed that free trade should be promoted through the abolition, or at the very least lowering, of tariffs. That international taxes on international trade should be stopped. That he hoped that globalization would unite us as a planet. Why don't we go to war with China? Well, we buy all their crappy stuff that they make. So it wouldn't be in our best interest to go to China. Why? Because we get so much of our stuff from there. We do so much business with them. Even though they're a communist nation, even though politically we're not the best friends, we are business partners, and it keeps us from conflict. So Wilson was very much ahead of his time when he proposed the abolition of tariffs. Next, that we should have mandatory arms reduction. The nations of the world should agree to destroy many of their weapons. After all, militarization is one of the underlying causes of the Great War. Perhaps an arms reduction could prevent future wars. If we're not all walking around with sidearms, then perhaps conflicts won't have to escalate. And then finally, Wilson proposed a step towards decolonization. Because remember, a competition for colonies, the quest to build empires, was another of our underlying causes in this Great War. And if we begin to consider the interest of colonial peoples and help them move towards independence, then perhaps that's a step towards improving the quality of lives for everyone, and prosperity brings peace. These are very noble concepts. The next points address how ethnic groups can form their own nations or join with others. One struggle you may experience when you leave your family's home is the struggle for independence. It can be difficult to transition from having few freedoms to having complete freedom and independence. It can be a struggle to transition from being a dependent on someone else. Your parents buy you your food, your clothes, the things you need, etc., to having to be independent. You are experiencing that now. You're undergoing that transition from dependence to independence. And it's not easy. Now imagine that on a larger scale. A colony was dependent on the mother country, sometimes for hundreds of years. Their government comes from the mother country. Their security, their law enforcement comes from the other country. Their economy is based off the economy of the other country. Largely, they are dependent. And now they have to become independent. And that's a rather difficult process, and so that's why so many different points were created just to address that particular problem. And then finally, the last point was the creation of an international organization, the very first of its kind, where representatives from every country of the world would come together to sit down and talk about their problems. I can't tell you how many times I've heard students say, what if every country could just come together and sit down and talk about their problems? And I say, tried that. Didn't work. Well, we do have that now. It was recreated as the United Nations. So if you go to Europe, you can go visit the United Nations. It is the place where all the countries of the world come to sit down and talk about issues. So the very first of these was called the League of Nations.
That sounds so right.
Yeah, it was an international organization. It was created for the purposes of promoting peace and prosperity all around the world. Here's a photograph of Woodrow Wilson introducing the League of Nations. The trouble with this plan is it was too kind. It was too generous.
I think that's the first time we've ever heard people say that about the U.S.
Yeah. It was too reasonable. And like you said, perhaps that is an uncommon criticism of the United States. You see, Wilson failed to grasp the anger and hatred and desire for vengeance of the Allied powers. We lost 40,000 men in this war, and that is terrible. Britain could claim they lost that many in a day in the Battle of the Somme. 60,000 British men gave their lives on one single day in the Battle of the Somme. They could honestly say, you have no clue what we're dealing with. In fact, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Lloyd George, was elected on the campaign promise of make Germany pay. Not make America great, not together we can change the world or any of that stuff. It was make Germany pay. Period. And the French felt the same way. They also wanted to make sure that another French invasion would be impossible. This had to be prevented. Meanwhile, Woodrow Wilson was forced to give up or compromise on most of his points. Perhaps the one he felt most strongly about was this idea of an international organization, the League of Nations. He was able to get the League of Nations approved and created, but he had to compromise on every other part of his plan to make it happen. And so Germany was forced to surrender under a different treaty. It was called the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty would create 9 new nations. Essentially, it was going to break up the nations of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. They'd be broken up into smaller nations. Why is the Middle East a mess? It dates back to the League of Nations. It dates back to the Treaty of Versailles. The Ottoman Empire, the last time the Middle East was united, was broken up into smaller territories. Harsh conditions were placed on Germany. They were not allowed to have an army. Now, really, these are the conditions to prevent an invasion of Germany. Because when we studied the Second World War, we'll learn there was an invasion of Germany. The Nazis had to surrender unconditionally. We destroyed Germany. We burned their cities. We killed millions. Germany was hoping to prevent that in the First World War. And so they surrendered. They declared an armistice, a conditional surrender. So we agreed, we're not going to invade your country, but you cannot have an army. You will have to give up large portions of your territory, Alsace-Lorraine, for example. And you would have to pay reparations, also known as damages, to the tune of $30 billion. $30 billion. I can't imagine how much money that is at the time, but I can simplify it by telling you it was enough to bankrupt them. It was almost as much money as the United States spent on the entire First World War.
Thankfully, the war was coming to a conclusion. Russia had already withdrawn from the battle after the Bolshevik Revolution. The Allied forces had aided the anti-Bolsheviks, however, and this led to long-term mistrust between Russia and the Allies. By November of 1918, the Allies, with fresh new American forces, began to turn the tide of battle, and German soldiers began to retreat along the Western Front. The German Navy ordered its fleet to set out to sea, but the sailors refused. In Germany, soldiers and civilians started organizing revolutionary councils. The people of Berlin rebelled against the Kaiser, who abdicated his throne and escaped to the Netherlands. No final decisive battle was fought. No Allied soldiers entered German territory. Instead, the German war machine ground to a halt. On the 11th hour of the 11th day in the 11th month of 1918, Germany agreed to a ceasefire that ended the war. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, America's ace fighter pilot, flew over the trenches when the armistice was declared.
On both sides of no man's land, the trenches erupted. Brown uniformed men poured out of the American trenches, gray-green uniforms out of the German. I watched them throw their helmets in the air, discard their guns, wave their hands. Suddenly, gray uniforms mixed with brown. I could see them hugging each other, dancing, jumping.
The bloodiest war to date was finally over. During its 4 long years, more than 30 nations participated in battle and in death. But even as the war ended, Americans faced still another crisis. A crisis at home that took more lives than the war itself. A flu epidemic gripped the country, and approximately 25% of the population fell ill with high fevers, headaches, and often pneumonia. About 500,000 Americans died. Businesses shut down, telephone service was curtailed, and corpses lay unburied due to a shortage of coffins. The epidemic, like the war, finally subsided, and a weary America looked to President Wilson and the victorious Allies to deliver a lasting peace. Even before the war was over, Wilson had presented his plan for peace to Congress, his 14 points speech.
We entered this war because violations of right had occurred, which touched us to the quick and made the life of our own people impossible.
Wilson's first 5 points dealt with the issues he felt had caused the war. Nations should no longer engage in secret treaties. The freedom of the seas must be restored, and tariffs should be lowered or removed altogether so free trade could flourish. Wilson demanded an end to the arms race and stockpiling of weapons. He declared that the interest and desires of people living in colonies should be considered by the imperialist countries who ruled them. Wilson's next points addressed boundary changes. Advocating the principle of self-determination, Wilson wanted any new national boundaries to be drawn along historically established lines of allegiance and nationality. His last point was the most important to Wilson. He called for the formation of a League of Nations to keep world peace. The members of the League would agree to protect each other from aggression and settle grievances without going to war. Following the ceasefire in December of 1918, Wilson and his wife Edith sailed aboard the SS George Washington for Europe to attend the Versailles Peace Conference. It was the first time in history that an American president left the United States while in office. Wilson was given a hero's welcome. Crowds cheered him. The citizens of Europe saw Wilson as their best hope for a lasting world peace. But the politicians of Europe, particularly British Prime Minister Lloyd George, who had won election on the slogan, "Make Germany Pay," and French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, who had lived through 2 German invasions of France, resisted most of Wilson's ideas. To them, the first and foremost goal of the peace treaty was to punish Germany so she could never wage war again. The peace conference did not include the defeated Central Powers, Russia, and the smaller Allied countries. The so-called Big Four, America, Great Britain, France, and Italy, hammered out the peace treaty among themselves. Time and again, Wilson was forced to concede on elements of his 14 points in return for the establishment of the League of Nations. Finally, on June 28, 1919, the Big Four, along with the leaders of the defeated nations, met at the Palace of Versailles to sign the treaty. The Treaty of Versailles created 9 new nations, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, while the borders of other countries were redrawn. 4 sections of the Ottoman Empire were made temporary colonies under the rule of France and Great Britain until they were ready for independence. President Wilson did manage to prevent some of the more extreme punishments, but the treaty demilitarized Germany, banning her Air Force and Navy and limiting her army to only 100,000 men. Germany was ordered to return Alsace-Lorraine to France. Most debilitating, Germany had to pay reparations, war damages, of $33 billion to the Allies, and admit total responsibility for the war. Certainly, Germany had played a major role in starting World War I, but other countries were equally involved. German citizens found the treaty outrageous, and there was no way the country could ever repay the Allies the money demanded. Instead of providing a lasting peace, the Treaty of Versailles began laying the groundwork for World War II.
So, weaknesses with the treaty. Number 1 is the war guilt clause, that Germany had to accept sole blame for the war. And as you heard in the clip, this is not true. Other nations were equally at fault. You could argue the war was inevitable. And certainly the fact that a Serbian terrorist assassinated the Archduke didn't help matters, and they contacted Russia, who contacted France, who contacted Britain, etc. So there was this alliance system, the culture of nationalism that had developed, the arms race that was ongoing, etc. Next, more practically, Germany didn't have $33 billion. They couldn't pay back this amount of money. And that's going to create troubles. Also, the Treaty of Versailles was not designed to be fair at all. Russia lost more territory than Germany did. Though Russia fought for the Allies. Meanwhile, colonized peoples' claims for self-determination were ignored. Those living in India would have to endure British rule for decades more. Africa would be no different. Of course, you're writing your essay on that subject. And these places which had been conquered around the world, well, what about Germany's colonies? They were simply divided between Britain and France. The same with any of the other Central Powers. There was strong opposition to the Treaty of Versailles in the United States. Some, like Herbert Hoover, thought the treaty was too harsh, feared that it would have lasting economic effects. And you could argue it did. These reparations, which Germany could not pay, caused a depression which bankrupted their country, which during times of desperation, people tend to turn to dictators That's just a common fact about human history. We see it over and over again. When people become extremely desperate, somebody stands up and promises to save them, to make Germany great again, to blame it on the Jews,
Donald Trump.
to find a scapegoat, and to promise quick solutions. Well, what is a quick solution from an individual? It's a dictatorship. That's what it is. It's fascism. And so there were quite a few people that were very concerned. Some felt this treaty did nothing for the colonial peoples, and that's true. All it did was exchange one group of colonial rulers for another. And then we have this other problem that the countries they drew up didn't make sense. Why do you think there's so much conflict in the Middle East? It's not entirely over Islam. It's the fact that the countries in the Middle East don't make sense. For one, Iraq is a nation of several distinct ethnic groups. Really, it should be several different countries. For example, there's a group of people in Iraq called the Kurds. They're the largest people group without a nation of their own. It would have made sense for them to get some kind of country called Kurdistan. But they didn't get that. And in Iraq, you have Sunnis, you have Shiites, you have these different ethnic groups which have historically not gotten along. It would have been more reasonable for these to, as Wilson wanted, for these nations' boundaries to be drawn on historic, ethnic, national lines. Instead, they were drawn by some generals in a boardroom. Some fear in the United States that the creation of an international organization could cause a danger to U.S. autonomy. That if the United States is forced to act on decisions made by the international community, that could mean a threat to our sovereignty. That if collective decisions are made, then we could lose our freedom. And that's how some people overreacted to this concept of an international organization. Henry Cabot Lodge was the most outspoken of these. Wilson, meanwhile, refused to compromise. He felt he was passionate about getting the League of Nations created. Again, he compromised on all of his other points so that he could get a League of Nations. He went on a national speaking tour to attempt to convince the nation to support the League. Doctors told him he needed to stop and rest, to take a vacation, to chill out and sleep. Wilson was like, I'm fine. I'm going to keep going. He pushed himself until the point a blood vessel in his brain bursted and he had a stroke. Have we ever cared about something so greatly that we push ourselves to the point of true exhaustion? This man was passionate about this idea. Meanwhile, the United States and Germany were forced to sign a separate treaty. The United States never agreed to join the League of Nations. It did happen. Wilson was able to convince Europe to create a League of Nations. However, we refused to be a part of it. Meanwhile, the consequences of the Great War. The United States emerged victorious. We came out with a stronger military, stronger government, stronger economy, more prosperous. This was the start of social change in the civil rights movement. You could kind of trace the civil rights movement all the way back to this. Women got the right to vote. However, culturally, we were affected. Xenophobia, nativism resurged. In fact, the Klan would reach its peak membership in 1924 after the First World War. in Europe. The consequences were devastating. The destruction and loss of lives damaged social and political systems for many nations in Europe. Communist regimes became popular. Fascism began to grow in power. The Treaty of Versailles does not actually settle the conflicts in Europe. It bred hatred and resentment that is going to be a direct cause for the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party.
Nationality feels so powerful. We fight for our country, we cheer for it, we draw our values from it. It's a big way many of us describe who we are, but it didn't used to be. Up until really recently, our identities came from stuff immediately around us. Clans, religion, family. If you think about it, nationality is weird. The idea that you identify with millions of strangers just based on borders. That's because national identity is made up. National identity is the myth that built the modern world, but it also primes us for dictatorship, racism, genocide. Today, we're fighting over whether to keep that kind of national identity. To understand why, you have to see how new this idea is. So you think you know what France is. It's a place united by the French language and the French ethnicity, right? But as of the French Revolution, half of the people there could not speak French. Only 1 in 8 spoke it well. These are the languages that people spoke, just a patchwork that didn't line up with borders. We know from modern genetics that ethnicity didn't line up with borders either. National identity became the idea that language, race, and borders should add up to a country. Nations can't admit they're made up, so they invent a national mythology that says they've been like this forever. The modern era brought 4 big changes that led to national identity. People moved in big numbers from the country to the city, and they needed a common language. New technology like newspapers and trains made countries feel smaller and more interconnected. War was changing into this vast, all-consuming thing. Countries needed people to care so much about their nation, they'd fight for it in huge numbers. Governments were challenging religion for power. Here's Napoleon taking his crown from the Pope to crown himself emperor. It was a big deal. These 4 things sparked an era of revolutions and democracy, yet they also unleashed ideas of nationalism, militarism, and leader worship. People came to see their countries as extensions of themselves. This new identity meant that a nation got its authority not from the government, or the king, or God, but from the people. This changed the world. But it also changed how we think. National identity changes our reality. We experience whatever happens to our nation as if it happened to us. Rocky IV can tell us a lot about what national identity does to our brains.
The Russian towers above the Americans.
A 1994 study tested the attitudes of Americans watching the movie. It includes an amazing footnote. All 216 participants were women because, quote, there were no males who had not seen Rocky IV. Anyway, when Rocky beat his Russian opponent, participants who strongly identified as American felt a boost in self-esteem. When they were shown re-edited footage to make it look like Rocky lost, they felt a drop in self-esteem, and they became likelier to hold negative views about Russians. But when they said something bad about Russians, their self-esteem recovered. And when we feel threatened, it makes us want to humiliate and dominate the outsider. That dynamic doesn't just apply to individuals. It can apply to whole societies. But this can drive war itself. One study found that any country whose team plays in the World Cup becomes likelier to launch attacks abroad. That hostility also plays out against minorities and migrants who don't fit the national myth. It only took a century for these problems of modern nationalism to culminate into World War II, something so terrible it convinced the world to try a new kind of national identity. This model of identity is based on an idea from the United States. Anyone can be American if you share values like freedom and hard work.
May I please remind you that it does not say RSVP on the Statue of Liberty.
It's a stirring idea, but it never completely worked.
Your race is your nation.
If you don't speak English and don't contribute, get out.
The belief that being American is really about race, religion, and language also runs throughout history. So what makes a country? Which identity should matter? That fight defines so much of the world right now, and it's intensifying. You see it in the backlash to the European Union.
We've got our country back.
You see it in how Donald Trump began his campaign.
We either have a country or we don't, and it's that simple.
The national myth is powerful. We fight for a common past and a common future. It isn't real, but that doesn't matter. We've been taught for so long that this is who we are. Building a world based on shared values really means creating a new myth. But that only works if it feels as powerful as the last one.
The signing of the peace treaty at Versailles signaled the official end of World War I, optimistically called the war to end all wars. But even during World War I, President Woodrow Wilson had feared the war was more about power and territory than peace.
Is the present war a struggle for a just and secure peace, or only for a new balance of powers?
One of the goals of the treaty was to break up the four empires of Europe. 9 countries were given new boundaries and independence. As a result of the remapping, Germany lost territory to its surrounding countries. The treaty demanded Germany accept full blame for World War I and pay huge sums of money called reparations to the victorious nations. Germany was also stripped of much of its military power and forced to demilitarize the area near the border of France, known as the Rhineland. The intention of the Treaty of Versailles was largely to punish Germany for World War I, but also to create new democracies and self-determination in Europe. But huge war debts, hunger, and unemployment made it difficult for some democracies to flourish. In the end, the treaty that was meant to secure a lasting peace for Europe had, in effect, laid the groundwork for war.